Okay, we're recording. We had somebody mention that we've been having sound issues, even though I have a super professional system here, ostensibly. Please tell us if you're listening on YouTube or Spotify and if these audio levels match up to what you're used to as far as music and other podcasts. And if there's a discrepancy between my audio level and Patrick's.
And mine.
Yes. Welcome back to the Being in the World podcast, episode 28. We thought we'd talk about boundaries today.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a real interest of mine always, because I've been always a proponent of kind of pushing at boundaries and redefining them. And I remember being in high school and reading this, I think it was Robert Frost poem, and the kind of stodgy old English teacher dwelling on the line, good fences make good neighbors. And I had just like a kind of viscerally negative reaction to that line, because I already thought that fences were meant to be broken down and we're supposed to, challenge. But now as I get older, I must say, like, both in relationships and in every other sense of the word, boundaries are possibly a useful and healthy thing. And then we were talking yesterday about boundaries, that make cell walls, and boundaries obviously make anything possible.
Well, yeah, the way that energy is stored and is transferred, and the fuel, the power for all of life is like separation of charge across a semi-permeable boundary, right? So like in order to create a sense of self and other, inside, outside, all of these things are boundaries. Just on the tiniest level, microscopic level, like even the little like proton pump across, like all of life is dependent on the proton pump, which is just literally pumping protons from one side to the other, which is just maintaining a little bit of difference between a boundary. And it is, that difference creates I forget the like current, I think, of a lightning strike for like a 1/1,000,000th of a second or something like that. Like just the separation of charge creates tension, and that tension fuels all of life. And I see this like when I think of I remember I have a friend who's a ER doctor up in Vancouver, Canada, and he was talking about how there's been gangs that have formed along the border, on both sides of the border, and how interesting it was, because there's a tiny, like, that just was not, the city was not prone to violence and it was not prone to drugs, but borders, like country borders, create a separation of charge the same way a battery does, which is just a separation of charge. And when you do that, you have like electricity, and the gangs are kind of, synonymous with effectively like separation of charge across a border. And this border happens to be semi-permeable in the exact same way that the cell border is to drugs and people and money, in a way that a cell is semi-permeable to like cations or anions or calcium or potassium. It's like the same thing. When you have a resource that's constrained with this artificial boundary, you're going to get charge, and that can manifest in many, many different ways.
So Terence McKenna talks a lot about this, because he's my favorite person speaking about psychedelics. If you guys don't know his talks, I highly recommend going on YouTube and going down that rabbit hole. Even if you're just not interested in psychedelics and you're just interested in someone expressing themselves in an interesting way and using the English language in a way that's super fun and exciting to listen to, surprising at all turns, look up Terence McKenna. And he was always going on and on about psychedelics being boundary dissolution devices, and that he said that the more threatened, the more boundary defined a culture or a civilization is, the more threatened it will be by the use of psychedelics. So if you look at very boundary free, like nomadic tribes, for example, they will be able to embrace psychedelics, whereas a culture that is, boundary defined is going to see the challenging of those boundaries as threatening, and therefore will have to make them illegal. And I told Mark Rathall this, and he said, well, what about Germany? They were one of the first to like make psilocybin legal. You can't think of a more boundary defined culture. And I said, well, maybe their boundaries are so solid that even psychedelics won't challenge them. That was my possible counter argument. And there's Ian Thompson, in one of the professors in Being in the World. He talks about that the Germans have such a deeply rooted kind of respect for boundaries that the Brazilian soccer team once like kind of exploited this fact by playing very, very close to the edge and noticing that the Germans had a natural tendency to be repelled from the edge, and that there was this little area right close to the line that if the Brazilians played along that line, they could exploit Germans' respect for that boundary, right? So I think there's a couple of places we can kind of delve into, which is, I think, cultural boundaries, like also like things like distance standing practices are really interesting because they're not explicit rules that we, teach each other. But if you go to a culture where people stand closer to you, you're deeply uncomfortable. You feel like that boundary around you of your physical space has been challenged, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's like boundaries around, sexuality and relationships, interpersonal relationships. I mean, I guess the distance standing practices is a little bit of both, but I'd be interested in kind of talking about cultural boundaries, political boundaries, and personal and relationship boundaries, and on the scientific level, what a boundary is. So I think we can run with any of those ideas if you have thoughts.
I mean, I think this relates deeply also to the home conversation we were having earlier this week in a previous podcast about what counts as home. My kind of anecdote about standing up with this middle-aged woman at approximately the same time, but I beat her to the bathroom, and us asking like what counts as when the line started forming in terms of like who should be in line in the bathroom, whether or not it's like when you need to pee, if that gives you priority. And so like, these are kinds of rules. I mean, all I have right now are just like instances of things in my head. So I'm thinking also of this documentary I saw in Japan.
What's the relationship between rules and boundaries? Are rules a boundary?
Well, I guess I'm presuming rules are kinds of boundaries. Yeah. I mean, in the same way that German story between Germany and Brazil in the soccer match, that those are kinds of rules, right?
Yeah.
That they're adhering to. And
I guess a boundary is a kind of rule, but there's rules that aren't boundaries, or maybe.
Yeah. I don't know. I personally find myself like challenged to adhere to my own boundaries. I'm not very good at them when I come up with them in social or relationship contexts. I struggle with maintaining them simply because I feel like the act of creating a boundary is the same kind of power that to dissolve the boundary. And I give no priority to my past self or my future self when present self just wants a thing that's different. And so they seem to be like equally balanced, synonymous powers. And so I just use the power at any given time.
Also, a lot of people who talk about boundary dissolution, they're actually just talking about moving a boundary, I think. So I think that you don't really want to get rid of a boundary when you think you're dissolving it. You just want to push it to a different place. Right. So you're not, I think there's an important distinction there. I do think there are places where you decide there's not going to be boundaries. There are very intimate relationships where you decide like, you're gonna not filter what you think and feel, and you'll have with your partner the same sort of honesty that you might have with your own self in your inner monologue, right? So you could imagine a pretty boundary free. But even in a relationship like that, there are boundaries, right? I mean, there are things that you won't do, right? I mean, you won't hit somebody, obviously, no matter how boundaryless your relationship is.
So then what have you pushed, or what boundaries have you moved? The line, I feel like we can have this conversation in generalities and then we'll never talk about the specifics, right?
So for example, in non-monogamy, you're pushing a boundary, you're redefining a boundary. There's still boundaries in the sense of it's not like a free-for-all, but you're saying I'm moving a boundary that other people have that's pretty rigid. You can't have sex with other people while we're together. It's me or them. So I think that's a pretty big boundary to take down. And I think that when you dwell in that space of boundarylessness, there's more like danger for all sorts. There's danger of hurt. There's danger of feeling unsafe. Like I think boundaries go up in order to protect people. And it's either from each other or from the outside world. I think monogamy is a boundary that is saying we're going to shut down the threat of attraction to other people. and we're going to create a boundary around that to protect the sanctity of our marriage or our relationship. So when you push that boundary, it's very, it's scary for a lot of people, and I think justifiably so. And that's one we've talked about a lot, obviously, and we can keep talking about it. And obviously one that's on my mind a lot.
Do you think the act of being able to like erect or create boundaries is, I mean, the power given to the person, and I guess I'm thinking of a romantic relationship here, the power, like there's an imbalance sometimes in the power to erect the boundaries, right? Where some people have more sway in the kinds that they create, and like both the rise and the fall of them can be kind of used.
So this occurs to me, the reason why we were marveling at the fact that a black woman friend of mine posted on Instagram right after we posted our polyamory episode, like things I don't want to try and learn from like white men about. And one of them was like polyamory. And I took it as a swipe directed at me, even though it wasn't just men discussing it. But I kind of like was a little baffled, like, don't we want to learn from everybody? But if, as you say, the boundaries and definitions of things have been provided too long by people of privilege, then maybe we don't want to hear about how those things are defined by those people, or we want to lessen their authority in some way, and maybe like we are actually, I guess the danger that they're worried about is that by taking the mic literally, we are reinforcing our power, right? I think that's a real danger. And I think it was a danger in the 60s with free love. Like a lot of women I've talked to around then would complain that men were using, these big highfalutin ideals of free love to just get a leg up on, and like say, what's the matter? Aren't you down with the revolution? Don't you want to fuck me? Like that sort of thing. I think you have to be very careful and sensitive about that. And hopefully today in a culture where we were talking about the fact that in my research in monogamish, I had confirmed many times something I hadn't thought about before, which is the fact that in the more macho a culture is, the less solidarity there is between women, because women are competing for the scarce resources of a few men who have the power and the wealth to share it with them, right? And so it's like a zero-sum game, and so women then are more likely to call each other whores and stuff like this, right? Whereas in a place where you have true empowerment, then there's more solidarity between women. And what we want, obviously, in the polyamory world, or in the world of like, alternative relationship models, is to have that against the backdrop of as equal power dynamic as possible. Because I guess erecting a boundary it's a power move, right?
Yeah.
Either erecting or taking it down.
Right. That's what I was gonna.
I guess people when they revolt, they are taking power away from the people who have it by dissolving a boundary that they may have erected.
And do you think there's kind of conversational boundaries as well? So like we just basically, like you can interrupting is a power move as well.
Yeah.
Removing someone's space is kind of like.
I'm sorry if the middle of my sentence interrupted the beginning of yours. sorry. I'm sorry if the middle of your sentence interrupted the beginning of mine.
I like it.
No, the other way around. Sorry.
You're interrupting yourself. That's very meta power.
When you interrupt me, I say, I'm sorry if the middle of my sentence interrupted the beginning of yours.
Right.
Go ahead now. I did interrupt you, but that's just because I'm just flexing.
Yes.
I want to show that I'm more powerful than you.
And it's very much like a thing that people do, like either conversational power dynamics or bullying or things like that, right? We witnessed it on a kind of public global scale very recently. Just like, one wonders even just those implicit borders and boundaries between like the effectively like attention or the right to speak, and so we're talking about whether or not power and privilege grant, whether or not this microphone grants something, whether or not the fact that we have an audience grants something, right? It's the power and privilege to speak. And in some sense, we're here safe in a boundaryless place where we can talk about whatever we want. But of course, the real world out there, we can't, right? We're impinging on our listeners in some sense. I remember this is going to be too much information, but there was a woman saying that who I had met, who it was late in the evening, and she had said she enjoyed how many kinds of sex were happening. There was other kinds of sex happening, and then what she had referred to was that she was reframing our conversation, which we had been up all night, just kind of like talking and enjoying each other's company, as conversational sex.
Interesting.
And I said,
you were being subjectified again?
I was being subjectified. It's my least favorite thing in the world, but it happens. And
anyone out there want to objectify Patrick? He's
well, you just posted like a naked photo of me on
I did.
your Instagram, yeah, finally.
But it still had a subjectification.
I know, everyone
in the caption,
right? Right. The caption for it was like, "Oh, thought
enthusiast."
Right. Can't just be me. Just on display.
We're objectifying your thoughts too. They are also objects.
If there's no distinction between subject and object, yes, I'm happy being objectified. But fundamentally, I think that's a filtered. It has to be filtered through the subjective anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's not actually the case that subjectification doesn't exist. It's that objectification doesn't, because it's going to be inherently subjective. But anyway, she was saying, "Oh, she's enjoying our conversational sex," and I was like, "Well, this is kind of funny because, like, when I'm talking, I kind of force, by virtue of the like physical, compression of air." I kind of force your ear and then your brain to hear. Yeah. And then I said, which is a kind of penetration in a way.
Yeah.
And then she's like, oh, that kind of just ruined it. It was great. But so, I mean, it was about conversational boundaries, right? Yeah. And not on a meta level, like on a literal level, that you often, when you the act of listening is a passive act. Right now, whoever's listening to this is forced to hear what I'm saying. And it's a bit, and by
they can turn it down though.
Well, but yeah, by virtue of them listening, they're kind of giving permission. But it's a physical, penetrative, forceful act. It's weird that I can't really. I can certainly filter in some sense what you're saying as you say it to me. I can maybe my own biases can come in and change what I hear. But fundamentally, you can't actually change. Someone can yell at you or say what they want to you, and you don't really have the power or control to other than not attending to them or not listening to them. You don't actually have the power to not listen. The brain just will listen.
Yeah.
And you can't do anything about it.
And so we have this boundary, like you talked about the other day about our skull being this incredible boundary, how difficult it is for a parasite to enter the brain, but how now that these social media companies are figuring out there's another way to enter besides with a parasite. And it is still a physical act of penetration when you're subjected to an image or a sound. You're saying, right? It's still a physical impingement that's happening, and so maybe that distinction isn't as useful as we may have thought. Like a subjective experience of something is a physical act of something entering your brain, whether it's an image, a sound, a sensory input of touch or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about it is that how little actual will we have. We're quite passive in our reception of the physical world around us. Like we have to do a bunch of stuff internally to make it happen and make it sensible. But once you are an adult and make it sensible, and you can see perfectly well and hear perfectly well, and everything's pretty much smooth. We really do become kind of passive recipients of a lot of this outside world. So I do actually like that woman's point that that just that we are, that the very a lot of how we get ideas across is a violation of boundaries, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very sensitive thing, and it's an honor, and it can be used in the wrong way.
And also, so I guess obviously the appeal of moving a boundary, and generally when someone is a boundary pusher, you assume they're pushing those boundaries outward. And a boundary defines a space, right? And whether it's a cellular wall or, more conceptual boundary, there's a space that it contains. And I think that the ideal of pushing those boundaries outward is to make that space larger, right? So I think that so my grandfather, my mother's father, who I very much related to, had a commune on the Amalfi Coast in the 60s. And he wrote on the door, which he took the locks off of, "It is forbidden to forbid." And then he said anybody can come and live there and stay there. And he didn't want to discriminate between cool people and uncool people. He just said, people show up here, they can come in and they can stay. Then he found that slowly people started erecting their own boundaries. They started putting locks on their own bedroom, once they stayed there for a while. And then he said, well, why should I forbid people from forbidding? I guess I'm going to, so he scratched out, it's forbidden to forbid. And he said, I'm even going to allow people to forbid. So I guess the area I'm most interested in exploring in my life is that space, that place of redefining boundaries and saying, well, what if we take this boundary that we just assume is supposed to be here and we just push it a little bit over here? What happens? And I've generally found that if you do it with not too much, egotistical, self-interest, and you have a genuine sense of like communication and compassion and love, for lack of a squishier word, I think that then you can push those boundaries and you can create a larger space in which that we can live and explore, right? So that's what I'm trying to do here in this compound, right? Is like take down the fences. Literally, when I got my neighbor's place, I took down all the fences and took down all the no trespassing signs. And the result has been the entry of more and more interesting people. And I think that my life is richer because of it. So there's like a place also where the egocentrism and the altruism of like inviting people into your space become mutually beneficial, right? Mm-hmm. I think the people who are like have these rigid boundaries, and I've mentioned this before, but a lot of people out here in the desert are very intent on reinforcing their boundary. This is my property, that my neighbors have 40 signs that say private property, do not enter, that do not, and they watch for footprints that might, Airbnb guests might, have impinged on their boundary. And to me, their life is impoverished because of it. They think their life is better by having these strict boundaries because they don't like people, maybe, or that's why they moved to the desert. Somebody said to me, like, to make me more compassionate for my old neighbor, said, people start to resemble their environment, and because everything here is very prickly, people are inevitably going to become prickly themselves. And there's probably something to that. And I'm thinking about all the plants here obviously do also need to erect strict, harsh boundaries, because otherwise they're just going to get, the resources are sparse, and animals are going to, everything's going to get eaten if it doesn't have a way of protecting itself.
That's very tit for tat defensive system of like, you invade my personal space, I will literally invade your personal space. I will stab you.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is also the American way, a bit of like, self-defense and having guns and all this stuff. It's I think Americans share this German predisposition, and Anglo too. I probably have a bit of this as a Southern European. I think we're more intuitively or dispositionally boundary pushing, right? There's more touch between men. There's more. I remember hearing about the Americans during the Iraq War getting horrified by the fact that men in Iraq hold hands just as friends. They walk down the street and they would like point their guns at people and say, "Stop doing that." They were so personally offended and disgusted by the idea of men holding hands, even if it was not in any way sexual, right? So that's like a boundary that was crossed that made them super uncomfortable. And probably they'd never even, a lot of these kids, they're kids, a lot of these soldiers, right? They've probably just never been confronted with two men holding hands. And they crossed the boundary. They went to another culture that wasn't theirs, and they saw things that made them uncomfortable. So there's a lot to be said for also, I think, teaching people to accept that the boundaries that we have are somewhat contingent on a lot of happenstance, right?
So the only sign you have, I can see it right there. It's clothing optional beyond this point, right? That's your only boundary on this. As you head to the pool.
And of course, it's half joke because clothing optional everywhere. But that's funny. It is, yeah, because that's the only thing I could find. I went on Amazon and said clothing optional sign, and all of them said beyond this point for some reason. So I guess you have to define a space where clothing can be optional.
Right.
And then I joked with people that some people have written me on Airbnb saying, "Is it true you're not allowed to wear clothes at the pool?" I'm like, no, it's clothing optional so far. Maybe one day I'll change it to clothing forbidden. But then I'm going to end up with my grandfather's paradox, right? Like, why should I forbid people from putting up a boundary, which you're making me realize clothing is a boundary, right? It's stopping me from seeing what's underneath. And some people might think that what's underneath is disgusting and should be hidden. Some people might think that what's underneath is titillating and should be kept that way. I think there's a good argument to be made for that. I think I've mentioned before that my father used to reminisce of the days when he was a kid. He was born in 1924, and he would say, we used to get an erection when a woman accidentally revealed her ankle getting into the car. And of course, as that boundary is dissolved, things become less exciting. So maybe we should I've had this thought about free the nipple, the whole movement, right? Like, of course, everyone should be allowed to be naked, and we should be able to post photos of nipples on Instagram. And why should there be a difference between the female nipple and the male nipple? But then again, there's a beauty to having something hidden and only revealed at a special time, right? And the idea of creating body parts and spaces in which a boundary is dissolved, and the very dissolution of that boundary is an act of shared, intimacy that individuates that moment and makes it special compared to other moments and other people. And I guess this is a big thing in monogamy. People are like, why would if you did that thing with somebody else, then it wouldn't be special between us anymore, right? So there's something to be said for saying boundaries are for maintaining a sense of uniqueness.
Uniqueness is important, right? So I'm thinking of a wedding I went to a long time ago where there were Polaroids that were taken. And the idea was a kind of anti-establishment, anti-digital thing where it wasn't the case that there'd just be, 300 photos, all of which would go to all of the people and just kind of be mass-produced, and you could copy it and watch it on your phone, etc. But there were Polaroids, and at the end, everyone got to pick one. And that was one, and it was just yours, and yours alone. And it was for you, and it was your kind of not property, but it was the memory and the experience in the photo for you alone. And I actually liked the way that it created effectively boundaries around these experiential kind of memories, right? Which is to say that photograph is yours and yours alone. So when you look at it, you think of it as yours. And so I do think there's a way in which, we, even if the boundary is not property, even if the boundary is not between two or more people in a relationship, some people maybe not all people, maybe you're just completely boundless in your desire to share. But I think some people like the kind of authenticity of unique experience, which can only happen when you have boundaries around things. Yeah. When you have boundaries around experiences, around memories, around objects, around people.
Yeah, of course. And that things it's in some way irreproducible. Unreproducible? Boundaries around like copyright too, for example. I'm thinking of, you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to copy this thing. There's an intrinsic conflict in the fact that digital media is infinitely reproducible, and that therefore devalues, a creative utterance.
Right.
And so people are trying to copyright law is a boundary. I guess most laws are boundaries, right?
One of my favorite legal cases around boundaries was in Major League Baseball. There was a kerfuffle about two fans. So someone hit a home run. It was interesting, like a momentous home run. I have no idea which one. And someone caught it in the audience. There was kind of a mob that happened, and the guy kind of briefly dropped it, and then someone else picked it up. And the lawyers and the judge and the probably jury had to decide who owned the ball when. And so while the ball was being thrown, it was owned by Major League Baseball. After it was hit, it became like a common good. As soon as it was clearly going to make it to the stands, even though the stadium was owned by a third party, not Major League Baseball. And then at some point when the first person grabbed it, the ball transferred possession and ownership to that person, but then they lost it, and it depended on how long the person had it in their hand. It was just all about the transfer of property,
yeah.
Because the ball was going to be worth $1 million, right? It was a very, very someone's home run record.
Yeah.
It was valuable,
right? And
so the question was, how did transfer of ownership occur?
Who won? Do you remember?
I don't remember. It was years ago. I don't remember.
So my friend Eric Berkowitz is a lawyer who's in my film Monogamish, and he was a lawyer who was very interested in writing about complex legal issues for a lay audience, and he was writing for the LA Times, and he was also very interested in the history of the law. And people would often ask him, what was the first law? And so he started doing research and thought that he would write a book on the history of the law. And that just sounds so dry. And he was lucky in the fact that he found that all the first laws were about sex. So he got to write a book about the history of sex in the law, which was a lot more titillating and a lot more interesting for people to read.
It wasn't like ancient Egyptian tax codes?
No, so the first law that he could find, the first instance of capital punishment on earth was in Mesopotamia. A woman who committed adultery was to be stoned to death. So it was all about, and of course there was no law, such, analogous law for the man. So the first law that human beings came up with that warranted in their eyes the death penalty was the woman breaking the boundary around the marriage to the man.
Right.
And of course, that's a pretty strong case for saying, well, it's a good thing we're pushing down those boundaries, right? I mean, it was an obvious attempt at controlling. And then Christopher Ryan says the whole idea of like boundaries around sexuality were instigated by the beginning of private property, and the fact that like before you have private property, this doesn't matter whose child a woman is bearing because they're all sharing everything. So it didn't matter who the woman had sex with. As soon as like there was private property, the man wanted to say, okay, well, this is my land and it's got to go to my son, so I better control what the woman does. So the first boundaries came around the property and around the sexuality at the same time. So maybe it's a much, much more direct kind of relationship between those two things.
There's some species of female primate that will have pseudoestrus even while pregnant. So even normally if you become pregnant, estrus will stop because you don't have more than one. But it's the case that like if a new kind of alpha comes in and kicks out the old one, they'll kill all babies that are born kind of earlier, quicker than it could have been possible for them to have made it. Mm-hmm. So they instead go into pseudoestrus, that women as a protective mechanism to basically like dissolve the borders between the like across the knowledge of all the men in the troop, knowing whether or not the kids are theirs or not. They'll just mate with all of them or most of them, or they'll have this kind of effectively boundary dissolving defensive strategy to kind of keep their kids from danger and harm. So it's very odd. I mean, so yes, to say like, okay, the first human law, but you're probably going to find natural versions of these kinds of laws around sex and these kinds of boundary borders and dissolutions.
So can you think of any examples in your own life of boundaries that you've broken down and been happy you broke them down, or dissolved them or moved them? And the opposite, can you think of any cases in which you accidentally or thought it was a good idea to break down a boundary or to cross over it and realized it was a terrible mistake? Because obviously that also goes into the whole Me Too movement, like a justifiable sense that women have had their boundaries disrespected for too long, right? And they're saying that's enough. And of course, as men, we're I think rightly being called to question our right and privilege to cross those boundaries willy-nilly, as we have for thousands of years. So there is a sense where like obviously we need to respect boundaries, right? That's like a super important lesson of this time, especially for us men, I think.
Pre-Louis' Me Too. Oh, this is not a story for musical accompaniment.
That was an accidental push.
Okay. Pre-Louis, Louis C.K.'s Me Too. So I had met a woman in a random place and we both had watched the show and liked the show, and so we ended up talking about it at some point, early in the like first and freshman and sophomore seasons, and we did end up kind of going back and becoming intimate, going back to my little apartment and becoming intimate. And there's a moment when so Louis has this episode about consent, right? Or I'm sure there's a few, but there's one in particular where a woman who he is hooking up with kind of starts to say no, and then asks what went wrong later when Louis, the character Louis, stops, right? Like I think the next day at school, I think it's a mother of another child at Louis' child's school. And then she's like, what went wrong? And he's like, what? I'm not gonna push that boundary just on the off chance you're into it.
Yeah.
And so then that night, after I had met this woman and we had already had conversations about Louis, she did the same thing. So she started saying no, and then I stopped, and then she's like, no, keep, like, what's wrong? Keep going. And I was like, it was funny because I didn't even have to say, you think I'm going to do this on the off chance you're into it. I was just like, you've seen the Louis episode. Like, yeah. I was able to refer to it. And it was just such a, like, it's extraordinarily uncomfortable on all the levels, right?
Yeah.
But of course, some people are into it. Like, that's the impossibly difficult aspect of the situation.
Especially in more macho cultures and where there's a lot of shame around sexuality, growing up and like hooking up with women in Italy or in South America, there was the expectation that in order to preserve their sense of like dignity and self-worth and like that they had to say no first. And if you said, okay, no, good night, hello, what do you mean? I didn't really mean it. But so now there's a backdrop of empowerment, and you can only have this conversation, it occurs to me now, in a backdrop where women have the power to say yes without shame, right? If you're in a culture where the woman saying yes in and of itself is a shameful act, then of course you're going to have this paradox and this difficulty. So in an ideal world, I guess you have the full empowerment to say yes or no and actually be able to mean it. And if you have a world that's dominated by religious, backwards reactionary views that often seep into people even who are ostensibly liberated, there's always going to have to be this play that I'm saying no even though I want it, which even saying that now is like so cringe-inducing, right?
Right. So that's the only time. That's the only time borders have been awkward, both awkwardly attempted to transgress and then also like immediately conversed about and immediately spoken about and talked about. But I mean, to your question of have I ever kind of crossed a border or crossed a boundary, dissolved one in my life, and then been happy for it, I have no idea. Yeah. It's a really hard question.
I think my whole life has been about doing that, and trying to do it carefully enough that I don't piss anybody off too much. Of course, there's a desire to piss off certain people on purpose. Again, that's that revolutionary idea. Like, I think when you transgress religious sexual mores, you are deliberately thumbing your nose at thousands of years of patriarchal boundaries around sexuality, which then we can ask, like, why were those boundaries erected to begin with? There's a case to be made for, like, I think Foucault said in The History of Sexuality, said that in the Bible there's as many strictures against food as there are against sex, and as much moral problematization is the word he uses. That the idea that it's a domain for moral, even discussion, right? Wherever you put the boundaries, like why are there boundaries there at all? And you could make a really pragmatic case for the fact that they are biological imperatives that also are fraught with danger. So at the time of the Bible, it was just as dangerous to eat the wrong thing as it was to have sex with the wrong person. Probably more so because there was probably more of a direct knowledge of the fact that eating something bad could make you very sick, and there was less germ theory and probably less understanding of venereal disease, right? So you could imagine that, but in both cases then there's the danger of pregnancy, right? So you have to, and then as food became safer, there's a kind of ritualized abstention from certain foods among certain religious groups, but for the most part, even the most ardent and fundamentalist Christian is not going to follow all the rules about what you can and can't eat, and they will have no problem ignoring those rules because they're just not a domain that really matters that much anymore. And then if you look at there was a brief window after the invention of birth control and before the advent of HIV and AIDS where sex became almost as consequence-free as food. And so then everybody started really relaxing, and it made less and less sense to have these boundaries around it. Then as soon as, like, in the 80s, like, there was this coincident move to the right in culturally, and there was this emergence of dangers around sexuality that, you know, I grew up terrified of, like, oh my God, if I'm not careful, I'm gonna die and kill somebody. I've had many sleepless nights in college wondering if, like, I was going to be dying from a sexual act, and that stuff stays with you, right? So you can see that there's like a rich layering of superstition, actual, justified fear, and tradition, and patriarchy, and religion, and power structures. I feel like all of these are intertwined in an intricate web of moral problematization and boundary erection. No pun intended. I got you speechless?
I got me speechless. Stumped.
Anyway, moral boundaries. And then politically, you said something about the interruptions. Just for those listening in the future, we've just had the worst presidential debate of all time. Everybody is pretty much agreeing to, I think. And what made it so bad was the constant disrespect of, like, each other's boundaries, mostly by Trump. Everybody acknowledges
and the rules of the debate and the rules of everything, right?
Yeah, just disregard for them, right?
But I mean, that's his oppositional defiance, right? That's part of the charm, so to speak.
Yeah, in big scare quotes, charm. Yeah, we just lived. We don't talk much about politics. I think neither of us have much interest in that, and hopefully, our concerns and conversational topics are more evergreen. And we're not really interested in tying it to a particular moment. But this is a pretty fucking wild moment. We just had this debate, and then this morning we woke up to the news that Trump has coronavirus, and after his months of willful disregard, and anyway, just very, very interesting times. I read that people are saying he's still somewhat mild, but I think Boris Johnson, who also is kind of older, not as old, but also a little overweight, he was diagnosed positive March 26th, and then didn't have to be brought to the ICU until April 4th or 5th. Had mild symptoms until then. So we really don't know what's going to happen right now, and whether it seems if anybody's going to be somebody joked today on Twitter that also Trump's tax returns just were released, and it showed that he has huge debt and earned no money and paid $750 in tax. So they said, the elderly, the obese, and the poor are the most at risk, and he is checks all three. And then someone subtweeted, and people of color, in his case, orange. Anyway, that's what's happening in the outside world, outside of this little desert like Shangri-La we've created. Side of the boundary. At the other side of our boundaryless boundary pushing little oasis we've created here.
I think we should create a boundary on this episode.
And just stop right here. All right, kiddos. Please comment what boundaries are important to you and why.
Till tomorrow.
I hope tomorrow. We've been a little flagrant in our disregard for our daily thing.
Oh yeah, it might not be tomorrow.
Soon.
But subjective, objective tomorrow.
Bye.